The tall black widow spoke to a man for the first time in 20 years when the giant mountain stranger collapsed at her door, half dead from cold and hunger. And she heard herself say the words that broke her sacred vow. Violet Gaines had not planned to speak. She had not planned for the blizzard that howled across the Wyoming territory like a living thing, clawing at her cabin walls with frozen fingers. She had not planned for the massive shape that stumbled through the white curtain of snow, lurching toward her homestead with the desperate gait of something dying. 20 years of silence. 20 years of nodding to shopkeepers in Dustwick, pointing at what she needed, laying coins on counters without words. 20 years of existing in the space between the living and the dead, keeping company with ghosts and memories. The people of Dustwick called her the tall black widow. They said it with a mixture of fear and respect, the way they might speak of a mountain or a storm, something powerful, something untouchable, something that demanded distance. She stood 6 feet in her worn boots, shoulders straight as fence posts. Her skin was the color of rich earth after rain, her hair wrapped tight beneath a faded headscarf. Her hands told stories of 20 years alone, calloused from fence mending, scarred from barbed wire and stubborn cattle, strong enough to birth a calf or mend a roof, but they trembled now as she reached for the door latch. The wind screamed through the gap as she opened it. Snow drove against her face like thrown sand. The man lay crumpled on her porch, massive even in collapse. His beard was thick with ice. His clothes were mountain leather, worn thin and frozen stiff. His chest barely moved. She had prepared for this moment without knowing it. In dreams, Thomas came to her. Her husband, dead 20 years this winter. In dreams, he asked her to keep the promise, to honor his memory with silence, to never let another man hear her voice, never let another man into the sacred space they had built together. But dreams were poor company for the living. The stranger's lips were blue as winter sky. His hands, the size of dinner plates, were white with frostbite. Death sat on him heavy, patient, waiting. Violet looked at those hands and remembered other hands. Thomas, reaching for her across their bed on cold mornings. Thomas showing her how to read the sky for weather. Thomas, disappearing into the copper mine that last morning, lunch pail swinging, whistling a tune she could no longer recall. The mine had taken him. Cave in, they said. Nothing left but rocks and darkness and a woman's promise whispered over a grave. She knelt beside the stranger. His breathing was shallow, irregular. Snow gathered in the creases of his coat. Soon the cold would take him. Soon she would have another ghost for company, but ghosts made poor conversation. Her voice came out cracked, unused, strange in her own ears. "You're dying. Come inside." The words hung in the frozen air. 20 years of silence shattered. 20 years of faithful mourning, broken by 3 simple sentences, and the sight of a man who would not live to see morning without help. She hooked her arms under his shoulders. He was unconscious, deadweight, but she had moved cattle and hay bales and furniture 20 years alone. She dragged him across the threshold into warmth. The cabin seemed smaller with him in it. Her furniture, built for a woman's scale, looked delicate beside his bulk. She pulled him near the fireplace, began working off his frozen boots. His feet were white, bad white, the kind that meant toes lost to winter. She filled a basin with lukewarm water. Not hot. Hot water would shock frozen flesh, do more harm than healing. She had learned such things in 20 years of solitude, when the nearest doctor was a day's ride and winter made that ride impossible. His eyelids fluttered, brown eyes deep as well water, they focused on her face with effort. "Ma'am." His voice was a whisper raw from cold. "Obliged," she nodded, did not trust herself to speak again. The sound of her own voice had startled her, foreign after so much silence. She brought blankets, wrapped him careful, left his frostbitten hands and feet exposed for tending. Outside, the blizzard raged. Inside, the fire crackled, and a woman who had forgotten how to speak tried to remember how to save a life. The fever came with dawn. Violet woke to the sound of muttering, broken words that spilled from the stranger's lips in delirium. She found him thrashing against the blankets, his massive frame shaking the floorboards. His skin burned. She pressed a damp cloth to his forehead and he grabbed her wrist without seeing her. His grip could have snapped bone, but his touch was gentle, desperate. "Can't let them find me." His voice was thick, distant. "Innocent blood on my hands. God help me, innocent blood." Violet pulled free. She brought more water, more cloths. His words troubled her, settled in her chest heavy as stones. What manner of man had she saved? What had she invited into her sanctuary? The fever broke on the second day. She sat by the fire, mending a torn shirt, when his eyes opened clear for the first time. He studied her face, the cabin, the simple furnishings that spoke of a woman's solitary life. "You tended me." His voice was stronger now, rough with gratitude. "Don't know your name, but I owe you my life." She set down her needle, looked at him without speaking. The weight of her broken vow pressed against her ribs. 20 years of faithfulness to Thomas, shattered for this stranger who spoke of blood and running. Name's Gideon MacLeod. He tried to sit up, winced at the movement. "Been living up in the high country. Storm caught me unprepared." She nodded, rose and brought him water, watched him drink with the careful attention of someone long used to silence. His hands were steady now, pink with returning circulation. He would keep his fingers. His toes, the frost had not claimed him. "You don't speak much." Gideon set down the cup, studied her with eyes that had seen hard country. "Can't say I blame you. Sometimes words do more harm than good." The truth of it hit her chest. She turned away, busied herself at the stove. Outside, the storm still raged. 3 days now of wind and snow that buried the world in white. No leaving for either of them until the weather broke. Gideon slept through the afternoon. Violet worked at her usual tasks, aware of his presence in ways that made her hands clumsy. She spilled flour, burned the evening bread, dropped her favorite mug and watched it shatter against the stone hearth. When he woke, she was sweeping the pieces into a pile. He watched her work, something soft in his expression. "Was a gift, wasn't it? That cup," she stilled. The broken pieces looked small in her palm, blue flowers on white ceramic. Thomas had bought it for her birthday, their second year married. She had drunk her morning coffee from it every day since his death. "I'm sorry." Gideon's voice carried weight, understanding. "I know what it means, losing something that can't be replaced." She almost spoke then. Almost told him about Thomas, about the promise, about 20 years of holding onto grief that had calcified into something harder than bone. Instead, she dumped the pieces in the waste bucket and returned to her silence. The storm gentled on the fourth day. Gideon could stand without swaying, walk without stumbling. He studied the drifted snow through her window, the white landscape that stretched unbroken to the mountains. Be another week before the pass is clear. He turned to face her. "I can't stay here taking your food and giving nothing back." She waited. "Let me work for my keep. Your barn needs repair. Fences too, from what I can see. I'm handy with tools, strong enough for most jobs." The offer hung between them. Practical help for practical shelter. Nothing more complicated than survival, the basic exchange that kept people alive in hard country. But Violet felt the danger in it. Not the physical threat he might pose, but something deeper. The way her pulse quickened when he spoke. The way silence felt different with him in it, charged with possibility instead of empty with loss. She nodded once, brief, final. "Thank you." Relief flickered across his features. "I'll stay until spring thaw, leave you be after that." She brought him his boots, mended now and waterproofed with bare grease. Their fingers brushed as he took them. The contact was brief, but it burned, a reminder of touch she had not felt in 20 years. That evening they shared supper in careful quiet. He ate with the economy of someone who had known hunger. She watched his hands, scarred and capable, gentle with her dishes. Mountain hands, working hands. Hands that had known violence if his fever words were true. The fire settled to coals. Wind rattled the windows, but without the storm's earlier fury. Tomorrow, they would begin the work of keeping each other alive until spring. Violet cleared the dishes, aware of his eyes on her movements. The cabin felt smaller with him in it, the air thicker. 20 years of solitude had not prepared her for this, for the simple presence of another breathing soul. She banked the fire and retired to her small bedroom, leaving him the main room and the hearth. Through the thin walls she could hear him settling for sleep, the creak of floorboards under his weight. She lay awake listening to him breathe. Steady, deep, alive because she had chosen to break her vow, to speak when silence would have been easier. Outside, snow continued to fall, sealing them together in the white world of winter. They worked in the language of necessity. Dawn brought them to the barn where winter had carved holes through rotted boards. Gideon measured gaps with his hands while Violet sorted through salvaged lumber. She pointed to what could be saved. He nodded and began to cut. The rhythm came naturally. She held boards steady while he hammered. He lifted the heavy beam while she guided it into place. 20 years of working alone had made her efficient, but efficiency was different from partnership. This was partnership. Her hands had grown soft in places during the long winter. The work brought back calluses, reminded her muscles of their purpose. Gideon worked without his shirt by mid-morning, steam rising from his shoulders in the cold air. She tried not to watch the play of muscle under scarred skin, tried not to notice how he moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to be gentle with his strength. They spoke in gestures, a pointed finger, a raised eyebrow, the tilt of a head toward the next task. Words became unnecessary when the work flowed between them, each anticipating what the other needed before the need became clear. By noon, they had patched the worst holes. Violet brought bread and cold meat to the barn. They sat on hay bales, eating in comfortable quiet while snow melted in patches around them. The storm had passed but left the world transformed, softened under white curves that hid the sharp edges of winter. Gideon studied the mountain passes while he ate. His eyes tracked the ridgelines with the focus of someone reading dangerous text. Whatever he was watching for lived in those heights. Whatever he feared would come from that direction. Expecting someone, the words slipped out before Violet could stop them. Her second break of silence in 20 years, and it came easier this time. Too easy. He turned to her with surprise. She had spoken so rarely he had perhaps forgotten she could. Always expecting someone. His voice carried weight, old worry worn smooth by time. Been 15 years of expecting. Gets to be a habit. She waited for more, but he offered nothing. The silence stretched between them, different now that she had chosen to break it, charged with possibility and thick with things unsaid. They returned to work. The afternoon brought them to fence repair, walking the property lines to assess winter damage. Posts had shifted in the freeze and thaw. Wire had snapped under snow weight. The work required closeness, one person holding while the other twisted new wire into place. Her fence had been failing for years. Small breaks she patched alone, larger problems she ignored because the solutions required two sets of hands. Now she watched the boundary of her world grow strong again, marked clearly against the open range. Good land. Gideon tested a post, satisfied with its firmness. Could support more cattle than you're running. She nodded. Had owned twice as many head before the hard winter 3 years past. Half her herd had died and she lacked the money to rebuild. The land was rich but empty, productive ground gone to waste for want of investment. Might be willing to work for shares instead of just keep. He spoke carefully, as if testing dangerous ground. Stay through spring calving, help you build the herd back up. The offer hung in the air between them, more than temporary help. A partnership that would stretch beyond winter, beyond the safe boundary of necessity into something that looked dangerously close to a future. She turned away, pretended to examine a fence post that needed no examination. The work was good. His presence was good. But good things had a way of ending badly, of demanding prices she was not prepared to pay. Think about it. His voice was gentle, understanding. No pressure, just an offer between partners. Partners. The words settled in her chest, warm and frightening. She had been half of a partnership once. Had learned how much it hurt when partnerships ended. Evening brought them back to the cabin, tired in the good way that came from useful work. Violet prepared supper while Gideon mended a bridle that had cracked in the cold. His hands were surprisingly delicate with the leather work, stitching with the patience of someone who understood that good repairs took time. They ate by firelight, the cabin warm with the heat of their shared labor. The storm had left the world quiet outside, muffled under snow that would take days to melt. They were sealed together in this small, warm space, learning the rhythms of shared living. Had a wife once. Gideon spoke into the quiet, his words careful and measured. Long time ago, before I took to the mountains. Violet's hand stilled on her plate. This was the first piece of his story offered freely, without fever or delirium to excuse the telling. Good woman, deserved better than what I could give her. He stared into the fire, seeing something beyond the flames. Some men aren't meant for domestic life. Take me 15 years to figure that out. She understood. Some people were meant for partnership, for the daily negotiation of shared space and common purpose. Others were meant for solitude, for the clean simplicity of answering only to themselves. The fire crackled between them. Outside, wind moved through the trees with the sound of distant conversation, voices too far away to understand. What about you? His question was soft, respectful of boundaries. Ever been married? The answer lived in her throat, 20 years of story compressed into a few simple facts. Married young, happy briefly, widowed long. But speaking it would make it real again in ways she had spent 20 years trying to forget. She rose and cleared the dishes without answering. Some stories were too heavy for evening conversation, too sharp for the comfortable quiet they had built between them. Gideon nodded, understanding the refusal. He banked the fire and settled onto his bedroll while she retreated to her room. Through the thin walls she could hear him breathing, steady and present. Tomorrow would bring more work, more shared silence, more of the dangerous comfort she was learning to crave. Outside, snow continued to melt, and somewhere in the mountains, whatever Gideon watched for continued to wait. The thaw came sudden, violent as spring birth. Water ran in torrents down the mountainsides, carving new channels through winter's accumulated silence. Violet woke to the sound of rushing creek water where before had been only the whisper of wind through snow. 3 weeks they had worked together. 3 weeks of shared meals and comfortable quiet, of tasks that required two sets of hands and the growing trust that came from daily dependence. Her world had expanded to include his presence, his steady breathing in the next room, his careful way of moving through her space without claiming it. The cabin felt different with him in it. Warmer, fuller. The silence between them had taken on texture, meaning. It was not the hollow quiet of isolation, but the rich pause between people who understood each other without need for words. But understanding could be dangerous. Violet stood at her window, watching Gideon work in the morning light. He was mending the chicken coop, replacing boards that had warped through the long freeze. His movements were economical, precise. He wasted nothing, not motion or material or time. She had learned his rhythms, the way he studied a problem before acting, the careful attention he gave to small tasks, as if proper repair of a chicken coop was as important as anything else in the world. He had the patience of someone who had lived alone, who understood that work done right the first time saved labor later. A rider appeared on the southern ridge. Gideon saw him first. His hands stilled on the hammer, his body going alert in ways that spoke of old danger. The rider was too distant to identify but close enough to matter. In country this empty, any unexpected visitor carried weight. Violet stepped onto her porch. The rider moved at an easy pace, not hurried but deliberate, coming here with purpose. She felt Gideon's tension across the yard, a tightening in the air between them. Expecting company. His voice carried no hint of concern, but his eyes never left the approaching figure. She shook her head. Visitors were rare, always had been. Her neighbors knew her preferences, respected her desire for solitude. Only necessity brought people to her door. The rider resolved into Sarah Mitchell, her nearest neighbor and the closest thing she had to a friend in Dustwick. Sarah rode with the urgency of someone carrying news too heavy for casual delivery. Violet. Sarah dismounted near the porch, her eyes flicking between Violet and Gideon with obvious curiosity. Need to speak with you. Gideon set down his hammer, stepped closer to the cabin, not threatening but present. Available if needed. Privately. Sarah's voice carried weight, warning. Violet nodded toward the house. They walked inside together, leaving Gideon in the yard with his unfinished work and the wariness that had settled over him at the first sight of Sarah's approach. Sarah poured herself coffee without asking, a familiarity earned through years of occasional visits and shared widowhood. Her hands shook slightly as she lifted the cup. Been talk in town. About him? Sarah glanced toward the window where Gideon was visible, still and watchful. 3 men came through yesterday. Lawmen, looking for someone. The words hit Violet's chest, cold and sharp. She had known this moment would come, had felt it approaching in Gideon's watchfulness, his habit of studying the mountain passes. They're asking about a mountain man. Big fellow, they said. Dangerous. Sarah leaned forward, voice dropping to a whisper. They say he killed a federal judge, say there's a reward for information. Violet's cup grew heavy in her hands. The coffee tasted bitter, wrong. 3 weeks of partnership, of growing trust and comfortable silence, and now this. The weight of what she had suspected, what she had chosen not to examine too closely. How much reward? The question came out flat, practical. $500. Sarah watched Violet's face carefully. Enough to save this place, pay off what you owe on the land. $500. More money than Violet had seen in years. Enough to buy cattle, repair what needed repairing, secure her future in ways that partnership with a fugitive never could. They say he's clever, been hiding in the high country for years. But winter drives men down, makes them careless. Sarah's voice carried the weight of neighborly concern and something else. Temptation, perhaps. The recognition that survival sometimes required hard choices. Through the window, Violet watched Gideon return to his work. His movements had lost their earlier ease. He knew Sarah's presence meant change, carried news that would shift the careful balance they had built between them. What's his name? The man they're looking for. Gideon MacLeod. Sarah spoke the name carefully, watching for recognition. Used to wear a badge himself, they say, makes it worse, a lawman gone bad. The name hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Violet set down her cup, walked to the window. Gideon had stopped working entirely now, stood with his back to the cabin, studying the southern ridge where Sarah had appeared. You know him? Sarah's voice carried no surprise. Been wondering why you suddenly had help around here. Folks in town are talking. Of course they were talking. The tall black widow, silent for 20 years, suddenly sharing her homestead with a strange man. In a country where news traveled slowly and gossip faster, such changes did not go unnoticed. What will you do? Sarah's question was gentle, understanding. Between women who had both learned to survive on their own, there was recognition of how few choices the world offered. Violet turned from the window. Gideon was walking toward the cabin now, his face set with the resignation of someone who had been expecting this moment for a long time. Appreciate you telling me. Violet's voice was steady, gave nothing away. Sarah nodded, finished her coffee. Lawmen said they'd be back through in a few days, checking on leads. She paused at the door. $500 would solve a lot of problems. The door closed behind her with the soft click of possibility ending. Violet stood alone in her kitchen, listening to Sarah ride away and to Gideon's approaching footsteps on the porch. When he entered, his eyes found hers immediately. The careful distance they had maintained, the unspoken agreement not to examine their arrangement too closely, was finished. Time we talked. His voice was quiet, resigned. Time I told you the truth about who I am and what I've done. Outside, the creek ran high with snowmelt, carving new channels through ground that had been frozen solid for months. Change was coming whether they wanted it or not, sudden and unstoppable as spring flood. Gideon sat heavy in her kitchen chair, hands flat on the scarred wooden table. The weight of 15 years pressed down on his shoulders, visible in the way he held himself, careful and still. Wore a badge in Colorado Territory, town called Cedar Falls. His voice was steady, matter-of-fact. Good job, respected position, thought I was making a difference. Violet poured coffee she did not want, needed something to do with her hands. The kitchen felt smaller with confession filling it, truth taking up space that had been occupied by comfortable uncertainty. Judge Cornelius Blackwood ran the territory court. Fair man, I thought, even-handed with justice. Gideon's fingers traced patterns on the table, reading invisible maps of memory. Took me 2 years to see what was really happening. The coffee grew cold between them. Outside, wind moved through the trees with the restless sound of change coming. Mining claims, native treaty lands being sold to white prospectors, paper that looked legal but wasn't. Gideon's voice dropped, carrying the weight of old shame. Blackwood was signing false deeds. My sheriff, Kane Whitlock, was running the whole operation. Violet set down her cup. The name meant nothing to her, but Gideon spoke it with the careful precision reserved for poison. Started noticing things, families being moved off land their grandfathers had worked, deeds that showed up after people disappeared. His hands stilled on the table surface. Good people, decent people, gone in the night with nothing but the clothes they carried. The fire settled in the hearth, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Confession was hard work, Violet knew. She had carried her own secrets long enough to recognize the effort it took to speak truth aloud. Found proof, documents showing the real ownership, the false transfers, enough evidence to bring down the whole operation. Gideon looked up, met her eyes for the first time since beginning his tale, took it to Judge Blackwood. Thought he was an honest man caught up in something bigger than himself. Violet waited. The worst was coming, she could feel it building in the air between them. He thanked me, said he'd handle it quiet, make sure justice was done. Gideon's laugh was bitter, empty. 2 days later he was dead, shot in his own office, and I was the only one who'd been seen going in and out with grievances against him. The truth hung between them, heavy as winter snow on a weak roof. Violet understood now why he watched the mountain passes, why he carried himself with the careful alertness of hunted things. Whitlock arrested me himself, had witnesses who said they'd seen me arguing with the judge, had my word against a dead man and a sheriff who'd been planning this from the beginning. But you escaped. Violet's voice was soft, the first words she'd spoken since the story began. Broke out during transport, been running ever since. 15 years in the high country, living like an animal. His voice carried no self-pity, just the worn acceptance of a man who had learned to survive on scraps. Innocent man with a price on his head. Guilty man walking free with a badge. The kitchen fell quiet except for the tick of her grandmother's clock and the settling of logs in the fireplace. Truth was harder to carry than lies, Violet knew. It demanded decisions, choices that changed everything. Why tell me now, though she knew the answer? Sarah's visit had changed things, brought the outside world crashing into their careful sanctuary. Because you deserve to know what you're harboring, what it might cost you. Gideon's voice was gentle, understanding. $500 would solve your problems, all of them. The money hung between them, tempting and terrible. Enough to save her land, rebuild her herd, secure her future. All she had to do was betray the man who had spent 3 weeks rebuilding her fences and sharing her meals. They're coming back. It wasn't a question. Tomorrow, most likely. Maybe the day after. Gideon pushed back from the table, began to rise. I'll be gone before then. Won't put you in the position of having to choose. Sit down. The command surprised them both. Violet had not spoken with such authority in 20 years, had forgotten she possessed such voice. Gideon settled back into his chair, watching her with new attention. Violet walked to her bedroom, returned with a wooden box worn smooth by years of handling. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were letters tied with faded ribbon. Thomas found something before he died, documents, deeds. Her hands shook as she untied the ribbon. Said there were men stealing land, forging papers. Said he was going to the territorial office to report it. The letters fell open between them, 20 years of secrets finally brought to light. Names and dates, land descriptions and false signatures. Evidence of the same corruption that had destroyed Gideon's life. He never made it to the territorial office. Cave-in at the mine took him first. Violet's voice was steady, but her hands trembled on the old paper. Always wondered if it was really an accident. Gideon studied the documents with the careful attention of someone who understood their significance. His finger traced lines of text, recognizing patterns and names. Kane Whitlock signed half of these. His voice was tight with recognition. Judge Blackwood's seal on the others. They sat in the growing darkness, evidence of old crimes spread between them on the kitchen table. Two people who had lost everything to the same corruption, brought together by winter storm and the strange mathematics of survival. They killed him. Violet spoke the words she had never allowed herself to think. My Thomas. Because he found out what they were doing. Probably. Gideon's honesty was gentle but unflinching. Good men were dangerous to their operation, still are. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling windows and setting loose boards to creaking. Storm weather coming, the kind that changed everything in its path. Violet gathered the letters, retied them with the faded ribbon. 20 years of carrying this burden alone, and now she understood why Thomas had died. Not accident but murder. Not chance but choice. The sound of approaching horses cut through the wind, multiple riders moving fast. Too early for the lawmen Sarah had mentioned, too late for casual visitors. Gideon was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with the fluid alertness of someone who had spent 15 years expecting this moment. 3 men sat their horses in her yard, badges glinting in the fading light. The leader was tall, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Kane Whitlock. Gideon's voice was flat, resigned. Didn't expect him to come personally. Violet joined him at the window. The sheriff who had destroyed Gideon's life, who had probably ordered Thomas's death, sat his horse with casual confidence 30 yards from her door. Mrs. Gaines. Whitlock's voice carried clearly across the yard. Need to speak with you about the man you're harboring. Come out and let's discuss this civilized. The moment of choice had arrived, sudden and unavoidable as spring flood. Violet stepped onto her porch, leaving Gideon inside with Thomas's letters and 15 years of accumulated fear. The evening air was cold against her face, sharp with the promise of storm. Kane Whitlock sat his horse with the casual authority of a man who had never been questioned. Silver hair, weathered face, badge that caught the last light of day. Behind him, 2 deputies waited with the patient alertness of hunting dogs. Mrs. Gaines. Whitlock touched his hat brim in mock courtesy. Been hearing interesting stories about a mountain man, about harboring fugitives. She stood silent, hands steady at her sides. 20 years of practice had taught her the power of saying nothing, letting others fill the void with their own assumptions. Now, I understand your position. Woman alone, harsh winter, stranger at your door. Whitlock's voice carried the reasonable tone of someone explaining simple facts. Charity's a virtue, but charity to the wrong sort of man can be dangerous. The wind picked up, rattling loose boards and setting the barn door to creaking. Storm weather building in the west, dark clouds piling against the mountains. Gideon McLeod's inside that cabin. We both know it. Whitlock leaned forward in his saddle, voice hardening. Question is whether you're going to make this easy or difficult. Violet felt the weight of choice pressing down on her shoulders. Behind her, through the thin cabin walls, Gideon waited for her decision. Salvation or betrayal, $500 or justice, safety or truth. He's a murderer, Mrs. Gaines. Killed a federal judge in cold blood. Been running from justice for 15 years. Whitlock's words were measured, practiced. The same lies he had been telling for a decade and a half. She thought of Thomas, dead in a mine shaft that had been carved too deep, too fast, too dangerous. All for mining claims that belonged to other people, sold by men who had no right to sell them. Course, We understand your situation. Failing farm, debts mounting up. $500 would solve a lot of problems. Whitlock's smile was thin, cold. All you have to do is step aside. Let justice take its course. The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and corruption. Behind her she heard the soft creak of floorboards as Gideon moved to the window, watching, waiting, ready to run if she chose betrayal, but running was finished. Sheriff Whitlock. Violet's voice came out clear, strong. The first time she had spoken to a man in authority since Thomas's funeral. There's something you should see. She stepped back into the cabin, returned with Thomas's letters. The evidence spread across the kitchen table, 20 years of waiting for this moment. Thomas Gaines found these before he died. Documents showing fraudulent land sales, false deeds, murder made to look like mining accidents. She held the papers steady despite the trembling in her hands. Your signature's on half of these. Whitlock's face went stone still. Behind him, the deputies shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. Don't know what you think those papers prove, but harboring a fugitive's still a crime. Whitlock's voice had lost its reasonable tone, turned sharp and dangerous. They prove Gideon MacLeod was telling the truth. Judge Blackwood was corrupt. You killed him to keep him quiet, then blamed an innocent man. Violet's voice grew stronger with each word, 20 years of silence finally broken for good cause. Gideon appeared in the doorway behind her, no longer hiding. His presence was solid, reassuring, the weight of partnership in the face of old corruption. Kane. His voice was quiet, tired. Been a long time. Not long enough. Whitlock's hand moved to his pistol grip. You're under arrest for the murder of Judge Cornelius Blackwood. No. Violet stepped forward, placing herself between Gideon and the mounted men. He's under my protection. This is my land. These are my husband's papers, and this is my testimony. The wind gusted harder, pulling at her skirts and hair. The storm was close now, rolling down from the mountains with the weight of change behind it. Mrs. Gaines, you're making a serious mistake. Whitlock's voice carried threat, barely concealed violence. Step aside. Let us do our job. Your job was to protect innocent people. Instead, you stole their land and murdered them when they complained. Violet held the letters high, evidence of 20 years of crimes. Thomas died because he found out what you were doing. Whitlock drew his pistol, leveled it at her chest. Behind him, the deputies followed suit. 3 armed men against a woman and a fugitive, justice twisted into its opposite. But justice had other ideas. Riders appeared on the southern ridge, moving fast through the growing darkness. Federal marshals, their badges visible even at distance. Real law enforcement, not the corrupted local variety. Expecting company, Kane. Gideon's voice carried grim satisfaction. Sent word south before winter set in. About corruption in the territorial courts. About innocent men framed for murder. The federal marshals surrounded Whitlock and his men with the efficient precision of professionals. Their leader, a graying man with steel eyes, dismounted and approached the porch. Marshal Davidson, territorial authority. He tipped his hat to Violet, studied the papers she still held. Mrs. Gaines, I believe you have evidence we've been looking for. The storm broke as they led Whitlock away, rain washing the yard clean and turning the dust to mud. Justice finally served, truth finally spoken, corruption finally exposed. Violet and Gideon stood on the porch, watching the riders disappear into the darkness. The storm raged around them, but they were safe, protected by truth and the strange mathematics of survival. Free man now. Gideon's voice was wondering, as if he could barely believe it. Free woman too. Violet smiled, feeling 20 years of silence finally lifted from her shoulders. Spring came early that year, the ground thawing fast under warm sun and cleansing rain. They worked the land together, rebuilding what had been broken, growing what had been stunted by isolation and fear. Violet's voice grew stronger with use, relearning the rhythms of conversation and laughter. She spoke to neighbors, testified at trials, used her words to build instead of hiding behind their absence. The farm prospered under their partnership. Cattle multiplied, fences grew strong. The land responded to the care of two people working toward common purpose. On quiet evenings they sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind mountains that no longer held threat. Sometimes they spoke of the past, of Thomas and lost years and justice delayed. More often they planned for the future, for crops to plant and improvements to make and the good work of building a life together. Violet had learned to speak again, but she had also learned the value of comfortable silence. Some truths were too deep for words, too important for anything but the quiet understanding between two people who had found each other in the wilderness and chosen to stay. The tall black widow was silent no more, but her voice was stronger for having been tested by silence, seasoned by solitude, and finally freed by the choice to speak truth in the face of corruption and fear. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.